That if you are online, please mute at this time and turn off your video.
So now let the fun begin. I would like to introduce to you, not only is he a board member of the Arlington Historical Society that you just voted for, he is also our speaker tonight. He is a columnist, author, and local historian, and he's going to discuss his latest book, Lost Arlington County. Arlington began 3 centuries ago as the farm section of Alexandria County and emerged in the 1900s as a vibrant suburb of the nation's capital. Global notice came after the creation and expansion of Arlington National Cemetery, the Pentagon, and Fort Myer, site of history's first airplane casualty in 1908. Add in some modern marquee employers like PBS, WTA, Nestle, the Foreign Service Institute, and Amazon, and now Boeing. It's a recipe for accelerated change. Unsurprisingly, we residents are increasingly at odds over rising housing costs and demolitions of long-valued homes and businesses. A key to preserving Arlington's character is deeper knowledge of its history, and Charlie is going to share that with you tonight. Thank you. Charlie.
So we're going to have some nostalgia, some fun, and we're also going to talk a little more seriously about what's going on in Arlington and what might happen in the future. I wanted to draw your attention to the story map that the Arlington Historical Society helped me create in 2019 in anticipation of the 100th anniversary of Arlington taking its name, and it's available on the AHS website. It's an interactive map that shows you the buildings that were visible in 1920, where you're walking around Arlington, and it not only shows you what they look like, but where they are on the map, which makes it fun. In the last year or so, we have experienced 2 major teardowns in Arlington, and this is what was called the Memory House at 6404 Washington Boulevard, also known as the Fellows McGrath House. Fellows being the first chairman of the Arlington County Board in 1932, and he was also the mayor of Falls Church in the late 20s too, which is an odd combination. And it was a bed and breakfast too for quite a while. And last December, that's what happened right there in my neighborhood. I happened to be there in time to get that picture. And the owner tried to sell it to more of a history-minded, preservation-minded buyer, but couldn't find one. And so it was bought by an entrepreneur who's building 2 luxury homes there on the site as we speak. A little bit earlier, in March and April of last year, the Fabre-Lothrop House met its fate, and its roots go back to the 1850s. And there was some presence of troops there during the Civil War, and it was built by John Fabre, who's the son of Nicholas Fabre, one of the major landowning families in Arlington. And the Lothrop family of the department store fame built this structure you can see here. And in 1950, it was bought by Randy Rouse, the home builder. And I did a profile of the house and got to interview Randy and spent some time with him. And then when Randy died in 2017, it was sold. It stayed loose for almost two and a half, 3 years. And the county considered buying it. There was talk of their putting a school there, or a park, or a storage area, or affordable housing, none of which ideas were fleshed out because the county was reluctant to spend the $23 million. And so the demolition permit came through while the county board and the Historical Affairs and Landmark Review Board were still arguing over how to protect it. And it came down in early April of last year. And just for fun, I wanted to point out this happened on this rare photo. Randy Rouse, the final owner, his first wife was the TV actress Audrey Meadows, who starred in the Honeymooners show in the late 1950s. They were married for just 2 years, and this was the wallpaper in the house that Audrey Meadows chose. It was still there until the demolition last year. This is another Fabry house. It came down in 1989. It was over on North Madison Street, 2100 block. And it goes also back to the 1850s. And there was enslaved persons on the property, and it was a Civil War hospital built by Nicholas Fabry. That's the guy who gave me the picture. That's Ron Anglin there at this Yorktown 1966 graduation. This is another Fabry house that we lost, and I have to take some blame for this. This is at the Overley Swim Club, which I am a member. And it had been the clubhouse there for 4 or 5 decades. And then about 6, 7 years ago, it needed a lot of modernizing and refurbishing. So it was torn down and a brand new one built. It had been built in the 1890s by Ernest Fabry, the grandson. And then it became a sanitarium for a while. Interestingly, the First County Board Chairman, Harry Fellows, died in that sanitarium. I'll learn that later. Now, I want to make it clear also that preservation, our desire to keep things alive, keep things in existence so we can help tell our community story. Not everything is good and not everything is worthy of preservation. This is the headquarters of the American Nazi Party on the site of what today is the Upton Hill Swim Club, right where the pavilion is. The American Nazi Party came to Arlington in 1958. That's George Lincoln Rockwell, the founder, on the right. And he was later assassinated right across the street at the Dominion Hill Shopping Center in August of 1967. But they had rented this house, which they called the barracks, from a widow named Kern, K-E-R-N-E. It was not preserved. Now, here's an example of something that I think is a success story in preservation. This is the Abington Plantation House, one of the final versions of it. The original house went back to the 1740s, but if you, it burned, and it was where the founders of Alexandria lived. The Alexandrians where the Custis family lived. George Washington spent time there, and eventually the Hunter family, which were important in the Civil War, occupied it, and it was burned down in about 1930. But if you go to National Airport, Reagan National Airport today, and you go to parking lot B, you'll go out, you can see signs that direct you to the reconstructed ruins of this place, which is an excellent display that honors the history of that site. This is a Civil War era engraving of the grist mill that George Washington Parke Custis had built using enslaved labor. It's right at South Columbus Street near George Mason Drive, sort of catty corner on the Columbia Pike from the Arlington Mill Community Center. He had updated it from an earlier mill that was there since about 1808. And after it was destroyed during the war, John Barcroft, a physician from Pennsylvania, moved here, and he built an even bigger, fancier mill. And that stood there until well into the 20th century. Right now, if you want to go, go down and look at the waterfall, you can hear the waterfall on 4 Mile Run. It gives you an idea of why Custis would have picked that site for a mill. This is a shot of the occupants of Freedman's Village, which was opened for newly emancipated slaves in 1863-ish on the grounds of what was Arlington House at the time. And it was there for 20 years, and it had a full-fledged community with schools and a hospital and job training. And that's a good example of something that left its mark when it was demolished by the War Department in the 1880s. The inhabitants scattered around and helped form the communities in South Arlington. This is an example of not so good preservation. It's an odd story. If you're at the Sheraton Hotel and you head out towards on Washington Boulevard to go back up to Clarendon, and you look to your right, this is what you'll see if you, maybe if you're not in the driver's seat, you have time to look out. You'll see these remnants of tombstones, and these are quite likely the graves of many of the enslaved people who worked at Arlington House or their descendants. And the Oddfellows Hall, which was a black fraternity, had been on that site until the 60s, where they were forced to move, and some of the officially identifiable graves were moved out to Alexandria, but you can still see these little remnants. But it really cries out for some signage and explanation. This is a rare photo that taken, I'm guessing, around the beginning of the 20th century. Shows Chain Bridge. It shows sort of a bar tavern that you can see down at the street level, but up on the hill, you see the Highview Hotel. And my colleague Jessica Kaplan wrote a good piece on the Highview Hotel for the Historical Magazine, but it was built 1890s as a luxury hotel, well advertised around the city of Washington with fancy chefs. But it fell on hard times. There was some violence there, a murder or two, and it got a bad rep in the local papers. And finally in 1912, it burned down. And of course, it was replaced by a very fancy home built in the 1920s. It's still there. This is the famous Luna Park that there isn't really any sign marking it, but it is today where South Glebe Road and Route 1 meet at the sanitation plant on the edge of Alexandria. But it was built early in the 20th century. It had waterfall chutes and Ferris wheels, and it had live circus animals, including elephants. And there was a famous episode, which I recount in the book. It's been written up many times, where the elephants escaped and scampered all over Northern Virginia, and they had to be found as far south as Burke. This is Arlington Beach. There's really not much of a sign at that anymore, but it's right near where today's 14th Street Bridge was. In the 1920s, when post-war prosperity was encouraging people to recreate, that this was an amusement park and water sports site that was very popular. This is what's called the Arlington Experimental Farm, which was built on the Custis property at Arlington House just around the turn of the century. And the agriculture department used it for a lot of avant-garde research into not just plantings and biological experiments, but also practical research on things like road building for farmers to economize and efficiency requirements in their how to get their products to market. And it was used during World War II, after the War Department took it over again. It was used as dormitory housing for the code girls who came to Washington during the war to work on the Japanese code. This is a picture of a real vanished Arlington, and this is Nelson Reeves, the last industrial-sized farmer in Arlington. He farmed from about 1901 to 1955 in what today we know as Bluemont Park and Playing Field, where I played many Little League games myself. And he gave the land to the county, then set up the ball fields there. And he stayed active as an electoral official. This is a friend lent me this documentation of the Congressional School, which I found interesting. It was originally located in Roslyn on Oak Street, in the house that General George Patton lived in when he, either during or right after, when he was the commandant of the Fort Myer. And the private school took it over, and in 1960 they had a terrible fire there and lost the property. And so they moved out to Sleepy Hollow Road, where the school is still going strong today. This is an example of items that are preserved because they're historically important and interesting, but maybe not the most beautiful in the world. So it sort of challenges people to decide what their values are. So this is called the Benjamin Elliott Coal Trestle. It's near my house. It's right at I-66 and Langston Boulevard at the Arlington Falls Church border. And that's the self-storage business right behind it. And it was used in the early 20th century when the railroads were going strong. And that was a railroad path that went right through the East Falls Church neighborhood. And the Shreve gas fuel company would use it. These cement barriers allowed the train tracks the train to stop and unload the fuel efficiently, and it would move on. And so, thanks to the efforts of the Nova Parks group and Bernie Byrne, the historian, they persuaded the authorities to preserve that. This is similar. This is the Halls Hill barrier segregation wall, and they had a nice ceremony about 4 or 5 years ago. I attended that, where the county dedicated it and erected a historic sign. But it's pretty shocking to people. This is, I think it's 17th and Culpeper in Halls Hill, that beginning in the around the 1930s, when the zoning ordinance, first one was enacted, that the homeowners were, it was outfitted, the code had setback allowances so that the white homeowners in these neighborhoods were encouraged to each erect at their own expense a portion of a wall that would separate them from the black neighbors. And of course, Halls Hill, which is now called by some Highview Park, is a big changing neighborhood, and there's all kinds of people there and several different civic associations. But of course, this kind of segregation was long been illegal, but it was important that some people would preserve this portion of the wall because it dramatizes exactly what was there at the time. I mentioned the railroad going through the East Falls Church neighborhood, as well as through Bluemont Park, which I mentioned. Adaptive use, when the railroads faded in the 60s, the rails to trail movement gained traction nationwide, and working with what was then called VEPCO and now is Virginia Power, Dominion Energy, I should say. Virginia Power came between those. Dominion Energy. They turned the railroad tracks on the WNOD trail into bike path, and then those are the Dominion Power power lines above it. It's a good example of combination of preservation and active use utility in the current day. So how many people recognize this building as the Blue Goose? Yeah, it was never officially called the Blue Goose. It was just that caught on in the newspaper coverage. It was built by the Broyhill construction firm in the 50s, and I grew up near the architect of it. I used to talk to him about it, and it held federal employees, CIA and FAA different times. And I talk about this in the Lost Arlington book when Marymount University acquired it, and they've been expanding into Ballston for years now. The president, Matthew Shank, thought it was the ugliest building he'd ever seen. So they made a promise to replace it, and the Historical Affairs and Landmark Review Board was not happy with that, and they were hoping that something could be done to at least preserve the mood of it, the motif of it. And I have to give credit for Marymount, which is our hosts here tonight, that they did an excellent job. If you go there today, where they have their offices and some, I believe, some classrooms, and then there's some residential buildings right in the same complex. They have a photo display out front that gives you the whole history of the Blue Goose and what it was used for, and they have lighting at night in that same blue motif, so that old timers will recognize it when they go by there. How many people recognize this structure? I see about 5, yeah. This is what's called the Bay Eva Castle. It's down there off of, in Upper Roslyn off of near Spout Run. And it was built in the 30s by a romantic couple of German origin. They were both in the OBGYN field. And those are their first names, Bay and Eva Jacobs. And they remodeled it after his family home in Bavaria. And so it was customized and beautiful building, but when they died, it fell on hard times and they couldn't find landlords. They rented it out to some young people for a while, and it was finally torn down in the, I guess it's the early 90s. So, but if you take a hike on the trails down there by Upper Roslyn, you can see that they have a nice marker to tell you what it's like. Yes, Michael.
Behind Dawson Terrace, Recreation Center.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, the trail behind Dawson Terrace. Very good. So then I just wanted to remind some people of some old favorites, which I do talk about in the book. Sears was, of course, worldwide, and Sears, as you all know, manufactured a lot of kits that became homes in our own Arlington. But its days were numbered, and it was a favorite in Clarendon. I used to go there for musical instruments when I was a kid, and I was able to do a column on dozens of people who worked there and have good memories of it. Let's see, this is an actual house being moved in the 1970s to make way for I-66. And I was wondering how many of you would remember this, depending on your generation, is that the plans to build an I-66 go way back to the mid 1950s. And there was always some resistance to getting the federal funding, and there was resistance from homeowners in Arlington who didn't want to just be a pass-through community for the good citizens of Fairfax and Prince William County. And in 1970, the Congress passed the National Environmental Protection Act, which required environmental impact statements for big projects like this. So that sort of changed the reasoning. And some Arlington activists, there were several groups banded together to sue to block I-66. Meanwhile, the state and the feds had used eminent domain and began condemning houses in the mid 1960s. And I interviewed several people whose homes were condemned and who had, they got roughly market value for them, but it wasn't, they weren't all satisfied, obviously. And the environmental fight went on and on and on until 1977, which is when the Coleman Transportation Secretary report finally came up with this formula. The original concept for I-66 was it was going to be 12 lanes, wouldn't have any sound barriers. So they more shrunk it down a little bit and required some mitigating factors. And so it finally opened in 1981. And this is an example of dozens of houses that were actually just moved to other lots. Other old businesses, you know, we used to have community newspapers in Arlington. We really don't. We have Arl Now, which is online. That's in Crystal City. The Sun Gazette is down in Woodbridge now. It was in McLean for a while. But this is the Sun office that was there in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And it's part of the new Clarendon plan. That site, you know, where Red Top Cab is in the entrance to Clarendon. That's where the Sun, Northern Virginia Sun building was for many years. That's where I remember going in there in the 60s. I knew Herman Obermeyer, the publisher, a little bit. Favorites, McQuinn's Sporting Goods, owned and operated part-time, I think, by George McQuinn, who was a professional baseball player, St. Louis Browns, who grew up here in Arlington, WNL graduate. There were a couple other sporting goods shops around. Sampson's was a competitor, and Sport Fair in Cherrydale used to go to. Favorite, Tom Sarris's in Clarendon. In the book, I chose to run a little advertisement from them to show you their reach around the Beltway. And there was a good interview with Sarris conducted by somebody I read recently. I was very impressed with that. The Public Shoe Store, there since the 1930s in Clarendon. And I got to know Saul Friedman there in the final years of his life. But he inherited from his father, and they were active in the Jewish temple as it was getting organized here in Arlington. So I talked a little bit about that. This is a really moody shot of 1950s Clarendon, which allows you to see People's Drugstore, no apostrophe in People's. It's interesting. And the J.C. Penney's in Clarendon. And there's, if you look hard, you see a G.C. Murphy's down there. All these 5 and dime stores, very popular. The only one that's left now, Ayers in Westover. And then finally, I wanted to emphasize that we can't stop change when we have these preservation battles, but as the pros like to say, we can manage it, and you can have people weigh in, and you can come up with creative solutions for problems, create for challenges. You know, if it's possible that if we had acted sooner, the Historical Society is in the past year has launched a more of an active preservation effort where we've sent letters to homeowners of old homes and realtors and builders, asking them to think twice before tearing down and do some research first. And we've written on how to research your own home. And we hope to weigh in more quickly when we learn of an experience of a threat to a property that we think might be valuable. But if we had had more time, it's possible that the February Lothrop House could have been negotiated where the facade could have been preserved, like is it sort of what's about to happen with the Joyce Motors site in Clarendon. The facade could be preserved and be a community house, and then maybe the Toll brothers, who are going to build 40 or 44 luxury homes on the site of February Lothrop, maybe they could have built 43 luxury homes, and we would have had that community center with the front facade, but it would take some commitment and some money. Same with the memory house, the Fellows McGrath. It had been a bed and breakfast before, and if we had helped find the right buyer, maybe it could have become a bed and breakfast again, and to preserve some of that beautiful gingerbread Victorian architecture. So I just wanted to end with the two renamings that our changing county has gone through. In my column, I call it the deconfedericization of Arlington. And this picture shows the implementation of what was years of debate on whether Robert E. Lee's name should have stayed on the old high school that dates back to 1925. Debates about why Lee's name was chosen, and how do we interpret Lee, and what do current students feel like about Lee, and what do the alumni of Washington Liberty High School now feel about Robert E. Lee? And the debate went on and on and on. You remember there was talk of it being Washington Loving High School, and the Loving family, which I reported when that name came up as an alternative to the renaming Lee Highway, the Loving family weighed in and said they were not interested in having any of that. They live down in Caroline County. So I personally had nominated Lafayette as Washington Lafayette, which I thought was nice because they were both generals, but Lafayette was an abolitionist. And you could keep the generals and it would still be an L. You know? So that almost worked, but they ended up with Washington Liberty. And there's still some adjustments going on there, I know, among the alums. And then this is Jefferson Davis Highway. You know, I was a little bit surprised to learn that a lot of the merchants in Crystal City, the people who operate the hotels and restaurants, had long thought that having Jefferson Davis Highway in their address was off-putting, that people from out of town would fly in and think they were in the deep, deep South, which as the people down in Richmond know is not Arlington. So I just want to remind people that change continues to happen, and it will happen in the future, but I'm hoping that we can be a little more systematic at the Historical Society and with some of the other groups in monitoring it and maybe sounding some early alarms when there are properties threatened, and see if we can come up with creative solutions. So that's what I prepared, and I'm happy to take any questions anybody has. That includes people online too.
What's next in your literary writings?
Well, thank you, Link. He's asking me what I'm working on next. Well, I have a memoir of a gap year trip I took when I was 18 years old to Europe and North Africa. And I'm going to be publishing that later this summer. A little more personal than any of the other things I've written, which means I might cancel it, but we'll see. And then my boss at the Falls Church News Press has signed me up to write a history of his paper. So I have the rest of the year to work on that. So, yes, ma'am.
So,
I guess if you're adding to your menu of Lost Arlington,
Yes.
the 7-Eleven at which George Lincoln Rockwell was killed is now a beer garden. So I remember that from my own.
Well, I'm not sure that's quite right. He was killed at a laundromat. At the,
in that same shop.
yeah, right. But you're right. There was a 7-Eleven there later, and it is now the Meridian Pint. Thank you. I had that wrong. Yeah. So very good. That's helpful. Yeah. In the drama of Rockwell's assassination, there's the Tom's Barbershop, which is still there, still called Tom's. And I interviewed Tom. Later, he had retired and moved down to Fredericksburg. They were chasing the assassin of Rockwell, who was up on the roof of the shopping center. And this is perhaps a subject for another talk, but in 2017, you all remember that was when there was the violence in Charlottesville with the neo-Nazis. A week later, it was the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Rockwell at that Dominion Hills shopping center. And I anticipated that neo-Nazis might return on that day. So I went to several of the merchants there, including Tom's Barbershop, and left my phone number and said, please call me if anybody shows up. I happened to be out with a news crew from Channel 4 who wanted me to show them where all the Nazis' houses were. There were about 5 of them in Arlington. And we were at Mario's Pizza, which is where Rockwell and the Nazis used to picket. And we were interviewing the former owner, who's a friend of mine, and we got this frantic call from Tom's Barbershop saying that the neo-Nazis are here. So we leapt in the van and sped down Wilson Boulevard, and we got there just in time for a picture of these 8 characters saluting, giving the Nazi salute there in 2017. So we published it. Yes, Michael.
I just wanted to add an addendum to that. There was a young lady in the community who organized a rally later in the day. And many people in the community came out. I live in the neighborhood, so I came out, and we have far outnumbered everyone else.
Excellent, Michael. My wife and I came to that too. Yeah. So it was a Facebook flash mob saying we are not a Nazi neighborhood. It was wonderful. Yes, please, Annette.
So the first question that somebody asked, actually we have a lot of reminiscing online. That's one of the good things. We can have a side conversation, particularly about Orland's house in Roslyn. But there is a question about who were your mentors in journalism and Arlington history?
Oh, wow. Well, at Yorktown High School, my journalism teacher was Harry Toole. And I'll never forget the favors he did me. And he gave me a lot of freedom. It was in 1969, 70, 71, at a time when we started to cover the greater community rather than just writing the same old school news that was almost the same every year in the academic year schedule. And so we went downtown and profiled things, and it was a little bit of a stretch. You find a link to the student body, but I would give Mr. Toole a lot of credit for that. And I guess my first editing job, my first white collar job after moving furniture for 3 summers was with Bob Massey, who was a Navy management tech writer, and he gave me a few pointers on how to write. So I appreciated that.
All right. The next question is, where can people online get your book? And I believe, and Annette can confirm, that we still have some through arlingtonhistoricalsociety.org. Yes, and
If you buy one from the Historical Society, it helps the society. But it's also on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and in AHS. Yeah, all those places.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, here's another one.
We have a
there,
conflict of interest there.
okay. Are there thoughts about addressing the McMansionization of Arlington, replacing beautiful homes, new houses much taller than surrounding homes that don't fit in the neighborhood? Let me scroll down to finish. And then take up the entire property, requiring removal of all trees.
Well, that's a question after my own heart. I have written several columns on that very troublesome issue. The problem is, there's 2 things. By right owners cannot, especially in Virginia, cannot just be overruled by third-party strangers who just happen to like the old house that's there, and they have a financial investment in it. And secondly, the builders profit more from these big boxes. And I did an interview with the builder, which I've published, where he said that some of them look pretty ugly, but because the builders start out saying, well, these people in the 21st century want a huge kitchen with an island in the middle of it, and 15-foot ceilings and a family room. And as long as you're doing that, why not throw in 5 bedrooms upstairs? Because they're cheap to build on the 2nd floor. So that's how you get these boxes. And it's very hard to tell the people who owned the 1950s Rambler that they want to sell at maximum profits for their nest egg, not to sell it to a builder who offers them cash right away. And it's very difficult. The county has pretty weak powers in preventing it.
All right, here's another. Has the owner of the Febri-Losif House grounds allowed the county historian to go near the grounds with a metal detector?
No,
He did not allow anybody. Was that the question, whether we were allowed, preservationists were allowed in? The county got in for an afternoon, got to take a couple of pictures. Cynthia Lechez Torres was very fortunate, but they didn't, the Rouse Trust, and I communicated with their spokesman a lot, but they didn't really feel obligated to communicate with the county, and they didn't synchronize their schedules on the demolition permit and different departments of the county bureaucracy dealing with demolition permits versus preservation questions versus budget people on whether we could afford, the county could afford to buy that property. So it was a little bit of a mess, and the county knows that. And Cynthia informs me that it will be mentioned in this coming master historic preservation plan, sort of a lesson learned kind of thing. So I'll look forward to that.
All right,
Yes, Tom.
Here's another one. When reading your book, I reflected on when we lived in Glencarlin. You mentioned the escaped elephants from Luna Park. You mentioned a resident scared by noises from the woods named Baucus on 5th Street. Was that Florence Baucus? She was very active in the Glencarlin Civic Association. You know.
Yeah, you stumped me on that one. I might have mentioned her based on a Carlin Springs history, but I'm not really familiar with her.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's